Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series, where we've been talking to paralegal and lawyer bencher candidates about the upcoming election. As always, the views and opinions are of the candidates alone, and they don't reflect me, Justice and Pieces, Trials College, or any other education institution or organization that I'm affiliated with. Today afternoon, we have Rod joining us. So thanks, Rod, for taking the time to speak with us. Perhaps you can start by telling us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I've been at the bar a long time. I think I'm 31 years in March, 1991 call. A lot of that time I was in sort of social justice ends of practice. I represented children's aid societies. I did refugee work. I did some narcotics prosecutions actually at the firm I was at. And lately, I've just kind of honed everything down to do a semi-retired practice back at Child Protection, very conveniently off the dining room table here at the cottage on Lake Huron. So it's a time to have a look at the broader context of what I've been doing for 30 years, I think.
And that, I guess, brings you to the 2023 bencher elections, and you've put your name forward here. So why are you running for bencher?
Well, I've had some concerns about the Law Society's behavior over the last few years, and had a chance to view them up close on a few things. And that sparked some interest that I had in how things are actually working at the Law Society, not just at professional regulation, which is how some of us get our first acquaintance with the Law Society, either the fear of that division or involvement with it. But I broaden my interest to how is the Law Society being governed? How well is it being governed? Has it stayed within its statutory mandate? How compliant is it with that statutory mandate? And probably the most important issue that started to trouble me was how divorced from the Law Society the membership is.
Now, I mean, so let's look at those issues there, right? And what do you sort of see in this election as things to kind of change, those ways, or look at things maybe a little bit differently? Perhaps you can kind of elaborate on some of the ideas and issues that you think are the most important in this election.
Yeah, this election as it's shaping up. I mean, I've scanned the sites of both the Good Governance and the Full Stop folks, and really, I don't see great definition of issues there. Actually, my issues are a little bit apart from what seems to be getting any attention in those two campaigns. Although I do have some sympathy with the first two parts of the Full Stop campaign. The woke issues, I think those are more an issue of how far do we get from the core mandate. But definitely the mandate, the creep, the bloat, that kind of stuff. I have some sympathy for that. What concerns me too about the other folks, the Good Governance folks, isn't that a lot like business as usual? I mean, that's the way that campaign sort of strikes me. And the only extent to which it's not business as usual is this anti-slate thing. And I have trouble seeing how slates are actually anti-democratic. I mean, to me, that is in fact how our liberal democratic systems work, right? A party is essentially is a slate. So yeah, I'm a little troubled by that, and it seems to be a little bit to the observer from the outside, maybe, that the Good Governance folks are running an anti-slate slate. And that's the way it appears to me. I don't see anything more substantial to it. And I noticed too, I was hopeful when I read through their page that I saw they support a working group on electoral reform, but it's only to look at the potential damaging effects of slate elections in the Law Society. And I just don't see that as, that doesn't make sense to me, how that is anti-democratic or not democratic.
And I think, Rod, I mean, because certainly talking to a number of the good governance, I mean, and exactly how you posed it, you had concerns about the stop group as it was then 4 years ago, coming together and suggesting there was vote splitting or dilutions of vote because they were getting all these votes together and other people were running on their own. So now you've created your own coalition to run in response to that, sort of fighting fire with fire, kind of loosely paraphrasing. And then if you're elected, then look at electoral reform to get rid of it. As you said, is that really anti-democratic, or is it just the nature of how elections are with the law study? I mean, it's a board of directors, right? I mean, maybe just in general, there could be ways to be more precise or more efficient in how we're deciding who's going to be on our board, right? And you pointed to, on the full stop side, right, the bloat and the creep. I mean, one of the things for bloat is, I mean, there's 53 people that are elected. I mean, does that also make sense, right? So I mean, I don't know if in terms of general electoral reform, not necessarily about slates and no slates, but I mean, is there any way that the law study could be more efficient in regards to just our board and composition itself?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that in terms of the numbers on the board, as you put it. And I think that is an accurate way of describing the benchers, the board, right? I think that is a point. The point that comes to my attention more and seems more concerning to me, and I wrote about this a little bit on my website on my response to Joe Groya. I mean, I think the concern I have is that probably it is most, but many lawyers do not feel like they are participating in the law society in any way. So that reflects itself in the number of people who vote in these elections. Most members, when I tell them that when I use the Law Society's own mechanism to try to reach my potential constituents, I can only reach 18,000 out of whatever it is, 47 or 57,000 people. So that's a minority that I can even reach, never mind persuade, right? So, I mean, that's to me a much, much bigger concern, right? The other big concern that I mentioned in my voting materials is I'm very concerned about what these representatives do when they get to Toronto, to Osgoode Hall, right? What is really happening there? I can tell you that as part of the work I'm doing with my website, I have reached out to benchers many times and got zero response from any bencher. Perhaps I get 2 or 3 responses, right? And if I really pester somebody individually, I might get a response. So what does that say about the numerous members of our law society who, are not hearing from a bencher, can't reach the bencher when they want to? So how is that person, and is the bencher is elected by a minority of members? What legitimacy does our board of directors, the benchers, actually have? I think that's a very fundamental question and an important one.
Now, Rod, I mean, on that point, I mean, the other piece that keeps getting brought up is although for lawyer bencher candidates and certainly paralegals for paralegal bencher candidates, although we're the ones electing these individuals, the 40 lawyer bencher candidates, for example, we're electing 40 benchers out of the lawyers. They're supposed to be governing in the public mandate, right? So then there's sort of this disconnect of, well, like you point out, well, hey, they're not replying to my emails. Now, who knows how many other people are having those same issues? But it then comes back to the voter turnout's been low. And I used to joke, I had the treasurer of the law society once came and spoke with my students, and I was talking to her and said, well, it's kind of like, when I hear the law society, I think of like the Darth Vader theme, like the big evil law society. So what can they be doing to sort of better connect with their the lawyers and the paralegals, the licensees, that can alleviate what you're saying is where there's this disconnect and people don't feel engaged with the law society, whether it's on the voter turnout or maybe in other avenues outside of, hey, in 2 days from now, I got to remind myself, right? I got to submit all my by March 31st. I mean, other than things like that, I mean, what should the law society be doing differently to better connect?
As I responded to Joe Groya in the piece I wrote, Mr. Goya complains about, the lack of voter interest and apathy. And I responded to him, voter apathy, if I can recall my distant days in political science, is usually related to efficacy, right? And if the constituent doesn't feel like they have efficacy, if their vote has efficacy, that's a good place to start. And I pointed out to him as a senior bencher with great respect, why has the Law Society not studied that question? Why have they not gone to one of their local universities to commission somebody to look into what is it that's degrading our democracy here? Well, it's a non-existent democracy, really. And I think the other thing that occurred to me as you were speaking was this problem of alienation, right? So I think a big part of the voter apathy thing is it's classic alienation to me. I think that most members of the Law Society fear it or feel oppressed by it or both, right? But they're one way or the other very much alienated from the Law Society. And any involvement with the Law Society just confirms your feelings of unresponsiveness and so on. There's a culture as well, I must say, and I've mentioned this in some of my material, the lack of civility that emanates from the Law Society. I mean, frequently when you hear anything coming from the Law Society, no matter how innocuous the context, you just have the feeling that there's this threat that just is not very far behind anything said by Law Society personnel. I think of the example, I just happened to be working for a friend of mine, just helping her out as she was very, very sick with lymphoma. And I essentially ended up in the role of wrapping up that practice. That's not what I meant to be doing. So I told the Law Society what I was doing, right? That I was in retirement, so I wasn't insured, but I was doing this. Were they okay with it? And the response was yes. Yeah, no, that's good. But it seemed every time they checked in on me to see what I was doing, I had the feeling that I was being policed. And I thought, that's so typical of the Law Society. I'm doing you a favor. I'm doing your work for you, really. And yet there's this feeling that your power has to be asserted in even this innocuous context.
Now, in terms of that, right, in terms of whether, what should the Law Society's role be, as a regulator, right, in terms of, and this goes back to CREEP, right, in terms of how the Full Stop group may phrase it, to stop kind of overreach. The Good Governance group may pose it as governance, right? It's important to have good governance and to oversee and make sure the profession is healthy. But I mean, as an unaffiliated candidate, and from some of the things that you've posted on your website about access to information, or the CPD programs, or just salaries of members of the Law Society, of staff of the Law Society. I mean, we're kind of on that sort of line there in terms of how they should effectively run our profession. What should they be doing? What they should be doing maybe more of? What should they be doing less of? I mean, what can you share about that?
Well, I think the thing that I found a little bit offensive, about if you use, I don't like this expression at all, wokeism or anti-wokeism. I don't think that barely discusses the issues at all there. I think the problem with all of that is I have long felt myself to be a person very concerned about human rights, civil rights, and just basic civility everywhere, not just here. Well, it's only very recently that I see the Law Society taking an interest in these issues. So first of all, I question jurisdiction. We have human rights agencies federally, provincially, right? We have labor boards, so on, right? So there are a number of things. So where is the Law Society getting jurisdiction to assert some of these other things? And it needs to be grounded, in my respectful view, in the statute, right? So what are you supposed to be doing? Protecting the public. Okay, so what is the direct tie to that? right, to those issues with protecting the public. It is there, I think, in some aspects, but I think there is probably a mission creep issue in there too, right? So I feel pretty strongly about that. There's another concern I have too, and I think you probably noticed that you've read a fair amount of my stuff. I'm not so sure how effective the Law Society really is in protecting the public. I cite the example on my website and in my materials about Phyllis Lewis. Now that's a case, that young lawyer I brought to the Law Society's attention. It's starting in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016. The dismissal of that young woman's prosecution was very, very, very questionable. And indeed, it was very apparent to judges, to transcribers, many of us, that that young lady posed a very real risk to the community. Sure enough, when I watched her revocation hearing just in December, she had defrauded Ms. Lewis of whatever it is, $85,000 plus HST. And I didn't hear the evidence of the second count that the Law Society did not proceed with. That's a very serious problem. I told them way back then how serious a concern this young woman was. And Ms. Lewis paid the price. And of course, it was under a power of attorney arrangement. So I don't think there's been indemnification, right? So that's very serious. And I have yet, in fact, I corresponded with the director of professional regulation about that and simply got denial. Well, there should have at least been a question in the postmortem, what could you have done better? But the Law Society wouldn't engage in that. That's a direct issue on the public interest, and it's appalling. So I'm not sure, like, whether the Law Society is now more in the realm of self-propagation, self-preservation, as I mentioned, as you noticed on the website.
So in terms of, I guess, the discipline and certainly there's the compensation funds, and certainly I know there's talk there. Again, I'm not completely well versed on the sort of the powers that they want for proceeding the PAC, right, in terms of different authority. And I know there's points on both sides of it. Is this, again, going too far? Could this be having a chill effect? Or, I mean, is this a way to effectively manage some of the issues, and then perhaps the ones that are much more serious, where you're looking at thousands or even hundreds of thousands or even millions sometimes at stake, that perhaps that puts less on the plate of the tribunal to kind of look at and deal with these things much more quicker. So, I mean, what do you see in terms of what the Law Society should be doing, kind of like that post-mortem you mentioned, and with that specific case? But I mean, generally, in terms of how we regulate lawyers, and I mean, a criticism that sometimes comes from the public is it's a lawyer. I mean, I think there's even like groups, there are lawyers protecting lawyers or paralegals protecting paralegals. But as you said, is it really in the public interest or not?
Well, I think it's the old adage, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, that sort of thing. The problem, as I see it with the Law Society, is accountability. That's where the rub really is where is the accountability? If you say your main mandate is protecting the public, okay, well, how are you accountable to the public? Well, the Law Society really isn't. There's no real mechanism to look at that and say, well, really, are you accountable? Like, how did you perform really? How can I examine that to determine on an individual case whether you were accountable or not? I think the problem is not so much at the tribunal level, right? Like that's public, that's got all kinds of quasi-judicial administrative body functions, right? And its associate protections. I think the problem with the Law Society is all the softer power, which is, very, very hard power if it's coming at you. I'm sure many lawyers have experienced. I refused to spend a dime on my case and dealt with it on my own quite successfully. But I know that there are lawyers who have spent quite a lot of money on that whole thing. And I think that the thing that has to be done here is, I think there needs to be a full inquiry, as I call for, into that whole division itself, particularly, right? The other issues of accountability, representation, that's one side of the coin. the other thing with professional regulation is I think that division really needs investigation. I am not impressed. I don't think anybody is impressed. And I think of the example too, when you hear from the law study for most lawyers and paralegals, I think there's a little bit of a feeling in your stomach, and it's not a good one, right? Well, I get a bit of that when, the police lights go off in my rear view mirror. Yeah, I do get a little shockwave of that, but I can't say I really feel fear, right? But I think a lot of people, when they have to deal with the law society, do feel fear, right? And why is that? Well, is it the sense that probably there is some maybe lack of competence, maybe there is some arbitrariness to it? That's my sense, is that that's what we feel. The very first introduction I had to that issue was I went to a friend when I first encountered my issues. And I said, what about this? Like, can you feel comfortable with it? The justice will take its course because you're innocent. You feel quite comfortable normally. And this person said to me, and she was a person in the know, well, they're terrifying, and you get the impression they're not all that competent. Right. And in the cases I had direct involvement with, I would have to say that was my feeling. Terrifying, though. Our body, our governing body is terrifying. It shouldn't be terrifying. I'm not terrified of the police. I'm not terrified of the judges. Why am I terrified of these guys? You don't have faith in the system, right?
Now, Rod, if you're elected, what would you like to see changed or done differently, whether it's on this point or anything else that we've talked about, that the Law Society should be advancing, as you're pointing out that these things have been big problems and raised red flags. What is a procedural change or something that can be done to better do things?
Yeah, I think this is the problem, right? And I think this is one reason that, it doesn't get done, right? What do you do about this complete electoral disenfranchisement, for example? That's a very big problem. I'm not sure what you do about it, but I think you begin by studying it in a rational fashion. And this is one problem that's evolved from the wokeism, or the full stop guys and the good government. Really the issue should not be either of those two things, right? It should be just rational, good government, shouldn't it? Right. And that's where I think we have to go. So where do you go with that? So for example, take the CPDs, right? Okay. So as yet, I have yet to hear what is the pedagogy that was considered when the CPD program was being developed. What was the efficacy expected? What is the accountability now when we have had a few years of CPDs? What does Law Pro say about it? Has it been effective in reducing claims? And in what way has it reduced claims? In what aspects of those claims? There used to be the fact that, the 1 to 5 year group of lawyers were not actually the ones most susceptible to claims. The theory was, well, they're nervous. They're, very conscientious. They want to do it right. It's after that when people start wanting to cut corners, right? So have we got at that kind of a problem? I don't know that I certainly can say I've never heard of any of the research that was relied upon. I'm suspicious that there may not be, right? And again, that just comes back to rational administration, rational public administration. And maybe that's the problem. The Law Society needs to realize it's no longer an 18th century club, right? It needs systems for rational administration, right? Rational elections, and so on, and rational discipline. And I don't think that process has continued, and it's become a victim of fashion, right? Inclusivity became very, very important recently, but the Law Society was just influenced by that fashion rather than a rational examination of what was deficient, what was inadequate, what was the remedy. That was a long answer, sorry.
No worries, Rod. And I guess if there's anything else that you want to talk about, I know you have a lot of literature, whether it's on your website, but anything else you want to address here for anyone listening, in your campaign to be elected as a bencher?
No, I mean, we've covered most of the issues, I think. Thanks very much. I think the primary thing that we need to get at here is getting truly involved in doing this thing properly. I think it's not fully appreciated by the membership just how out of control this is. 500 employees, the CPD unit alone, with many employees and making windfall profits, not just breaking even, but making windfall profits. Is there temptation there for, something like CPDs to be paying salaries that we don't need? I don't know. I mean, I think that the membership need to be very much aware that this thing is out of control, that the culture, the police type, and I would go further about professional regulation. That's not just a police culture that's developed in that unit. It's a secret police culture. You cannot learn, for example, yourself, what is in the Law Society files about you. Now, why can't you have access to that, right? You can do it with the police, right? The police are not permitted to keep files on you, right? But these guys can keep a file on you, an ongoing file, and there's nothing in the legislation permitting them to do that, right? There's a complaint, you're permitted to respond to the complaint. That's the end of it, right? But no, there are all these other things that they may have there, and they won't let you see them.
Now, Rod, with all your years of experience, perhaps you can remember back to when you were a student. I have students, paralegal students, and others that are listening that are looking to embark on their legal career. Any words of wisdom, any advice for them as they get started?
That's a big one. And I've tried to, as I've gotten older, I've tried to be less presumptuous, less opinionated, and try to avoid the temptation to be a sage and that I've learned this or whatever. But I think my message to anybody, probably anywhere, would be always drive for the rational disposition of any issue, including ethics. You might be 1 out of 1,000 people that actually see the question properly. Just be sure to examine the issues in an austere, emotional and intellectual environment. Be sure you're right, do your research. And that's key, I think, for all of us. And I think that's where we've gone amiss with this Law Society business. It's too affected by too many things other than rational disposition.
Finally, Rod, last question here. For any lawyers that are listening to this and they have up to 40 votes next month at the elections, why should they use a vote on you, Rod?
Well, I think it's important, that's all. That's always a tough question. Why am I great? Right. So I appreciate you're not asking me why I'm great, but what do I think that I bring to this that other people are not bringing or not enough people are bringing? Let's put it that way. I think it's a determination to look at this thing clearly for what it really is, not for what people think it is or what people expect it to be or want it to be. What is it really? And what it is really is a thing that's become out of control, not democratic, not well governed in many, many aspects, and not the fashionable ones that full stop and good governance are talking about, right? It's the big fundamentals. We got a big membership. Are they actually being represented, and is the public being actually protected, or is that just a dodge for accountability to the membership? That's what I have found too often is it's not your Law Society, it's the public's, right? Well, I'm not sure it's the public's either, right? I think it's just you're hiding that no one can hold you accountable.
Perfect. So once again, thanks, Rod, for taking the time to speak with us this afternoon. Thanks for everyone for tuning in. Take care.
Yeah, thanks so much.